Frequently, when we talk about a weak pawn or strong pawn, we keep in mind a few other aspects. For example, there is no such expression as structure of bishops. There is no such a thing as structure of knights, but there is structure of pawns, pawn structure, which means strength or weakness of one pawn often depends on other pawns. So one of the important aspects of the strategy, of pawn structure strategy, is islands. How many islands, how many pawn islands there are. And as a general rule, the less pawn islands you have, the better off you are. That means if you have one pawn island, that means all your pawns are connected, and this is strength of your position. Of course, a lot depends on activity of your pieces, but if we just talk about pawn structure, that you want to have as a few pawn islands as you can, possibly. So let's look at the game between two very famous grandmasters, Piquet and Belявsky, that is very typical for good or bad pawn structures. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, castles, e3, b6. Very famous position of Queen's Gambit declined. Bishop e2, bishop b7 for black. White plays bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, c takes d, e takes d, and white castles. Now let's talk about this position just for a few seconds. What is white's plan in this position, and what is black's plan? White has good pawn structure. There is nothing wrong with black's pawn structure, except for one little thing. Black's bishop on b7 is not very active and is blocked by d5 pawn. White has chance for pawn minority attack, which means white may be able to expand on a queen side and isolated d5 central pawn. Also, white may, in some cases, play knight e5 and f4. So white has those two plans. What does black have to do? Black cannot just sit and wait. They have to design some active plan. And only active plan we can think of is connected with c5. But if black plays c5, that may result in a weak pawn on d5, or, as we frequently use in chess, hanging pawns. Those pawns on c5 and d5, they may be strength and may be weakness. So let's see how it develops. Pawn structure right now is normal, and neither side has any advantage. But as game develops, you have to go on with your plan. And we talked about it, plan in the game. What our plan in the game? To develop king side or queen side attack. And then pawn structure will change. So the way we go with that, white just castled, queen e7, queen b3, attacking d5 pawn, rook d8, rook f to d1. Now, black has to develop. Where to develop b8 knight? b8 knight most likely has to go to d7, where it has some future f8 and e6 and participate in the center. But you see, you cannot play knight d7 because your d5 pawn is hanging. So c6 is kind of necessity, and at the same time, you see the bishop on b7 is not good. c5, as we mentioned, as part of one of the plans, is not possible for black. That's why white played rook f to d1, because after c5, d will take c, b takes c, and white is attacking d5 pawn 3 times, and black has only 2 defenses, so black is going to lose a pawn. So at this point, c6 was played by Bilevsky. That's the best move. Bishop to f1, bishop to c8. This move just to activate the light square bishop. g3, played by white. The idea to put bishop on g2 and put more pressure in the center with possible e4 in the future. Bishop g4, bishop g2, and knight to d7. White consolidates their pieces, rook a to c1 and rook a to c8. Now both sides fully developed. We talk strictly now about middle game plan. And often you don't play this position and then start thinking what my plan may be, because this is like a part of your opening repertoire. When you play this position, you already know what you should be playing for. And white tries to increase the pressure in the center. Knight e2, knight f8, h3, bishop f5, and knight f4. White's possible plan is to go knight to d3 from f4 and then knight to e5 to put more pressure on weak c6 pawn. We can tell right now that white already has a target. c6 is a target, and whole game, as it happened, revolved around the c6 pawn. So after knight f4, g6, queen a4, being consistent, playing against the c6 pawn, bishop g7. Well, it looks like we have 2 attacks on c6 pawn, but we cannot win c pawn yet, because after rook takes c6, black may go maybe queen d7 or probably bishop d7 too, and white is pinned very badly on a4, e8 diagonal. Nevertheless, pressure on c6 remains. Black goes b4, white goes b4, black goes b5, white goes queen a6. Now you see the c6 pawn is real weak. Also, we notice that c5 square is also very bad for black. Black is experiencing now severe problems. Queen takes b4 is necessity. And rook takes c6, rook takes c6, and queen takes c6. Let's talk about this position. Position is very bad for black. We start in the beginning of the tape, we talked about pawn islands. Let's talk about pawn islands. White has 2. One is a2 pawn, which is isolated island of the pawns, and the other 5 pawns from D to H file. They are all connected. Black has 3 pawn islands. That means 3 pawn islands that are not connected pawns. One is 3 kingside pawns. The other island is D pawn, which is extremely weak at this time, and the third is A and B pawn. So white clearly has upper hand, and black's pawns are very weak. At the same time, you have to notice that bishop on g7 is not that good, is not active. Knight on f8 is the same way. So white's pieces are better placed, and pawn islands are to white's favor. So after queen takes c6, black played queen a4, attacking the rook on d1, rook a1, queen c4. Well, it takes one move, one bad move, as frequently in chess game, to get from winning position to losing position. That move would be now queen takes c4. Of course, not the move that was played in the game, because now when black has bad pawn structure, all of a sudden they can retake with dc, having two connected pass pawns supported by bishops, and black is winning. Of course, white will not take on c4 and played queen a6. Now black has to face reality and start defending all these weaknesses they created. Rook d7, because weakness on a7 has to be protected. Rook d7, knight d2. You see, white is attacking queen on c4 and preparing to play knight b3 and knight c5. Very well planned. Very weak square on c5, and that's where knight goes. Queen b4, knight b3. So pressure on d5 is very serious, so black must go bishop e4, somehow to relieve the pressure. Rook c1. Now that black's so preoccupied with defending their pawns, their weak pawns, white gains advantage on open file, on piece positions, because black's pieces are not prepared to contest white, because they are all too busy. Queen on b4 protecting b5 pawn, rook on d7 protecting d5 pawn. That's not the mission heavy pieces like a rook and queen should be doing. That's not the mission for them to protect pawns, but this is necessity now. And after rook c1, black goes g5, white goes knight h5. It's just inevitable for black to create more and more weaknesses. h5 is another weakness. Knight e6, bishop takes e4, d takes e, just king g2, queen a4, rook c8 check, knight f8, and the rook takes f8 check. Now this position, this is very simple shot, rook takes f8, and the reason why rook takes f8 is possible because black's pieces are very discoordinated, and the simple tactical shot like rook f8 will end the game now. Rook takes f8, and here is concretely why it works. Because if king takes f8 now, then white has decisive check. You see, queen c8 check, and after king e7, knight c5, or knight takes g7, and game is over. Knight c5 is absolutely decisive because queen hangs and rook on d7 hangs. So for this reason, black is forced to capture white's rook with the bishop, and then we get to the end game. Knight f6 check, king g7. Obviously, if white wants to go to end game from the middle game they had when they had big advantage, only acceptable end game is for white that is totally winning endgame. Otherwise, makes no sense to go from a big advantage in the middle game to any kind of endgame other than winning. Knight takes d7, knight f6 check, king g7. Queen takes a4 first, of course. B takes a, knight takes d7, a takes b, and a takes b. This position is absolutely and unconditionally winning for white. White has protected pass pawn on d4. Extra pawn, bishop d6, g4. Very good move. Blocking the light squares and preparing for f3. So what white wants, they want to penetrate with the king. The only way to do that is by playing f3 and force black to take. But if they play f3 right away, then white plays f3 right away, and then black plays f5. So white is playing g4, stopping f5. So g4 is a good move. King g6, now f3. E takes f, king takes f3. You see, black's king cannot come into the game, so black tries to play f5. But that makes e4 possible. F takes e, king takes e4, and you see that white has an extra pawn and also much better king position. After king takes f4, king f7, king d5, bishop g3, king c6, and king e7. White played d5 and black resigned. That's a very timely resignation because after knight c5 and then knight e4, white pawn marches without any problem. d6 and d7, and now knight maneuvers goes to e6 square, knight c5 or knight e6 or knight b7, and black has no counterplay, no counter chances, and that's why they resign. Now, very well played and very typical example of pawn islands. So black had a lot of pawn islands. They were way too busy to protect their pawn weaknesses to create any kind of a counterplay. And that absolutely gave white an opportunity to get overwhelming pressure in the center and on the queen side, and white won the game. The next game I wanna talk about is game played between two young and very talented grandmasters, maybe less known to you. Between Boris Avrok, very strong grandmaster from Europe, and Onishchuk is the Russian grandmaster, Ukrainian grandmaster currently living in the United States. So let's look at the game. This is also a very interesting pawn structure battle. d4, f5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, castles, knight f3, actually knight h3, d6, bishop g5, c6, queen d2. Now let's talk about this opening. This is Dutch defense, Leningrad variation, where black fianchettas the bishop, and black's plan here in as far as the pawn structure goes, to play knight d7 and e5, get some kind of strong presence in the center and get an active position. Knight h3 is designed very frequently for playing d5 and knight f4. At the same time, white played bishop g5 and queen d2. They may keep in mind to exchange dark square bishop. So after queen d2, white played e5 right away. Now black played e5 right away. And now they are very active in the center. They have even space advantage in the center. Their development not as good yet, but let's see what happened. d5, white played, and black goes c5. This looks very good for black, because what black has here, they have very strong center, closed position, and their pieces can quickly be developed as well. However, it's white's move, and white goes e4. White cannot allow black to complete development and play e4 and then go knight d7 and knight e5, because white then is going to have very cramped game. So e4 played by white. Queen e8. Honestly, I don't understand this move. I don't like this move. I think the normal move like knight d7 is a lot more appropriate. Sometimes grandmaster thinks that I know I have to develop pieces, but this position may be an exception. I don't think this is an exception. Black is not developed, they have to develop. That's as simple as that, and there is nothing else that is more important than to develop. Queen e8, e takes f, g takes f, and bishop h6. Now, by playing queen e8, black has another worry. That they cannot play something like queen g6 or queen h5, because after exchanging, they have to worry about knight b5 as well, attacking d6 pawn and c7 square. So what they have to do now, they have to play also a6 move. Now white plays bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and castle. Now let's talk about this pawn structure. There's a very good pawns in the center. But good pawns, they need good use for them. There is no good use for white pawns here, black center, because black is not developed. They don't have good way to develop those pieces. What is queen doing on e8? Nothing. Queen e8 move costs black 2 tempos, because after queen e8, they have to play a6, and to tell you more, most probably remove the queen from e8 as well. White can concentrate their pieces on king side, and black is going to have very hard time. So what happened after a6, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, white castle, and black went b5. Now this move I cannot criticize as much, because I have a sympathy for black's position. They are in a bad shape here. So they are creating some kind of, they're trying to create some kind of a counterplay. b3, b4, knight a4, and queen d8. Total admittance of the wasting moves. Queen d8, knight g5. All of a sudden now you see that white wants to change pawn structure. They want to play knight e6, and if bishop takes, pawn takes, opening this g2 bishop. G2 bishop was a sleeping beauty, and now it's a very powerful piece. So after knight g5, rook a7, knight e6 obviously, bishop takes, de. Black is lost. Black is lost because e6 pawn is very strong. There is no way to just come over and take this pawn. For example, on queen e7, if nothing else, white can play bishop d5. Also, they can play rook d1. And you see black's knight on b8 is very pitiful. And you see that pawn on e6. We talked about this. It may be a very weak pawn and may be very strong. This is the case when it's very strong. On top of everything, there is an idea of queen g5 check. And when king moves, white can simply take this f5 pawn. And now they have advantage in pawn structure and they have an extra pawn. So next move for black is forced. They go f4. Rook a to d1, attacking d6 pawn. You'll see more and more trouble coming black's way. Knight e8, but now queen is not defended. So white can easily play knight takes c5. This is pawn number 1. Queen e7 and knight e4. Queen takes e6, rook f to e1. Beautiful position of white's pieces and very pitiful position of black's pieces. Rook f to e1, knight c6, g takes f. This is already absolutely hopeless, because on a move like rook takes f4, white has a luxury of playing knight takes d6, and if knight takes on d6, then queen takes f4, winning a house. So now after g takes f, black goes king h8. The last hope for black to maybe play rook g7, rook g8 to create some kind of threats on a king side. White goes knight g3, blocking the g file and opening the e file. Queen c8, protecting the knight on c6. Bishop takes c6. Queen takes c6. F takes e, d takes e, and queen d5. How frequently we see when you have advantage in a pawn structure or any other kind of positional advantage, it's being transferred to material advantage. White has an extra pawn right now. They're about to get second pawn. Game is totally decided. Queen takes d5, rook takes d5, knight f6, rook d takes e5, and we can close the case now. White has protected pass pawn, 2 extra pawns, and better piece position. One of those components is enough to win the game. They have 3 of them. So a5, rook f5. We're going to go quickly through this part of the game. Rook a6, rook e7, a4, rook b7, getting ready for pawn number 3, a3, rook takes b4, rook d8, rook e5, knight g4, rook e4, rook g6, c5, h5, rook b6. This part is not exciting at all. Rook g to g8, h3, trapping knight, and finally black made one of the best moves in the game. They resigned. So this is very typical game of bad planning. Queen e8, queen d8. Black made 2 active moves, f5 and e5. They exposed their pawn structure, their pawns, to attack by white pieces, and white took very good. White took advantage of it very nicely. Now, the next game I want to look at was was quite different from the one we just looked, and it was also advantage of a pawn structure, taking on a pawn structure played by two young GMs, Ernst and Reinderman, both Dutch players. But the game was played in about 2 or 3 years ago, in 1998, in Dutch Championship. Knight f3, d6, d4, knight f6, d4, f5 actually. This is also Dutch defense, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, and d5. It's okay for black to waste time to play d6 and then d5. That's not really a mistake. There are a couple of other occasions in different openings when I can show you the same example, going d6 and d5. d5 was played to stop white from playing e4, but now that white cannot play c4 anymore, jumping over their knight, it's okay to play d5. So that's another mistake. We're not going to be criticizing this. e3, c6, bishop d3, e6, knight e5, bishop e7, white castled, so did black, and now f4. And after c5, white played b3. Let's talk about this position. Both sides have central square for their knight, outpost. White has e5, black has e4. But white is better developed. And one other thing that is in white's favor in this position, the fact that, you see, corresponding piece to bishop on g5 is black's bishop on c8. White's bishop is beyond their pawn structure, which is f4, e3, d4, which makes it an active piece. At the same time, black's bishop on c8 is inside of their pawn structure, d5, e6, f5. This is very, very important, which means that black has one bad piece, the bad piece in c8. So white has some advantage, far from being decisive. Let's see how game goes. b3, knight bd7, white goes knight e2. Knight takes e5, f takes e, knight e8, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. Let's talk about this position. It's bad bishop on c8 and bad knight on e8 make black's position very difficult. White chose here c4 move, which is okay move. White still has an advantage. However, it's not the way I would have made, and I played many games against some very strong opponents, even on internet. I played against some super powerful computers, and the good way to play this position is to totally abandon the center and the queen side. White has enough pawn advantage, enough pawn structure advantage to start immediate and very aggressive play on a king side. What I would have done, and I strongly, strongly believe that it's the best plan here, is knight f4, king h1, and pawn g4. White is going to have extremely strong attack, and it's very, very difficult for black to overcome this. And also white is going to have positional advantages because those pieces cannot compete with You see, if you pay attention to knight on f4 and bishop on d3, and you compare it to knight on e8, bishop on c8, it's like a day and night. So when pieces are passive, it's the good time to start attack on a king side. That's the way white thought in this position. They started immediately, they tried to immediately take advantage of black's bad positions. But the difference between plan I suggested and whatever happened in the game, white played c4, and now black's pieces can defend the center. However, after knight f4, they are totally helpless with a possible g4. White played c4, knight c7. You see, knight has to come into the game anyway, and supports d5 square. Knight f4, d takes c, bishop takes c4. Black played rook d8, queen d2, and b6. What happened here? Knight on c7, that was horrible piece on e8, became good. Knight can go to d5, close to the center. Bishop on c8, that was terrible, may become a best piece on the board for black. Going to b7. That's not the way to take advantage of it. However, again, I have to admit that white still has a better position. Not as good as they would have gotten playing the other way, but still very good. Queen d2, b6, rook f to d1, c takes d, e takes d, bishop b7. Well, 6-7 moves ago, black could have only dreamed about this position. Queen f2, knight d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5. Now there is a good bishop on d5, and there is a good knight on f4. I think position is approximately equal because white mishandled completely the pawn structure and in the center. So rook a to c1, rook d7, and now white plays rook c3 and prepares attack on a king side. From now on, I like very much the way white played this game. Rook c3, rook ad8, rook g3. The threat number 1 is coming up. Knight h5, attacking g7 pawn, and threatening knight f6, check, winning the rook. Actually, after rook g3, played king f8. King h8 might have been met by rook h3 and further assault of black's king. King f8, rook h3, and now h7 pawn is hanging. So g6, queen e3, queen f7, and rook h6 for white. Now this position is a very good position for white. They have very good attacking chances due to knight's position on f4, very well placed knight. But white could have had a lot more if they kept black's light square bishop behind their pawn structure. You see, opening the center never helped white to achieve position they did. They could have just done this, transposing rook to h6 or opening positions on king file on king side without bringing black's light square bishop into the game. Nevertheless, the position is good for white. After rook h6, black played queen g7, white played rook h3 back. It's okay to waste time because there is no counter play for black Now rook c7, rook to f1, rook to c2, rook to g3. Now white wants to play knight h5, attacking black's queen and bring the knight possibly to f6. Queen f7, h4, bishop e4. This is the final and critical mistake. Position is bad for black. White wants to go h5 and open more files on king's side. However, bishop e4 is a flat outright blunder. Simple combination: queen takes e4, pawn takes e4, knight takes e6 check, and you see that white is going to win the queen back and the rook will be hanging. So black plays king e7, rook takes f7 check, king takes e6, rook takes h7, and rook takes d4. Now, as almost every game we looked so far ends up with winning endgame. Rook takes g6, king takes e5, rook g8, rook takes a2, rook e7 check for white, king f4, and h5. You can tell h5 pawn is very difficult pawn to stop. Rook d1 check, king h2, and rook d5. Now black tries to play rook h5, rook f7 check, king e3, rook g3 check, king e2, and h6. Now this h pawn is unstoppable, because after rook h5, rook h3, you can see that if black takes white's rook, then they will not be able to stop the h pawn. So last attempt for black to play, it was rook a5, and now after g4, black resigned, because they have to take white's rook, and white takes back, and black's rook cannot get to h file anymore, and pawn queens. So from this game we learned that position that white had, they had overwhelming pressure on a king's side. Now let me show you a couple of pictures, the way it can develop. It's not the game. I will just show you the structure. How useful can it be not to open the center, and how powerful it is to perform attack on the king side without opening the center in this particular example. I've had a number of games that played in a similar type of opening. Well, actually, opening can be played many different ways. It may be even through this opening, which is queen's pawn opening, c3, c5, knight d2, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, white castles, black goes knight c6, knight e5, castles. It's just rough example. Knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, or even without knight takes e5, if black goes something like rook c8, white goes f4. Let's talk about this position. Knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight d7, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. And if we go something like queen e2 and black goes f5. Now we have structurally the same position white had in previous game, except white had a lot more than black has now. White had knight is already on f4. Also, black's bishop, light square bishop, was on c8 and was very passive yet, and knight was on e8 without any future. Now, if this position is nearly winning for white or big advantage for white, can you imagine how good could have been the position in a previous game? This position, I assume, is winning for white. So white has big advantage. Maybe winning is too strong of a term. King h1 if we play. Where is black's counterplay? Anytime white plays g4, black will not be able to capture on g4. The reason why, when we go g4, and if black captures and we take back, now what we have? We have bishop on d3 that is actively playing against black's king, knight on d2 that can be easily transferred on king side, and easier access to open files than black has. Black's pieces, knight on d7 and bishop on b7, are totally helpless for the to defend black's king. But bishop on b7, totally helpless for any mission at all. It cannot come into the game, cannot support queenside play. And when you have piece like this, when your opponent has piece like this, you don't want him to open and control big diagonal. This is the kind of pawn structure we saw in the last game that white made. So they let black get rid of bad knight, double on d file, and have bishop on d5 shooting both diagonals. That's not the way to play. That's what I can criticize white for. However, you got to give white a credit for the way they played the rest of the game. Well-conducted attack and nice shot in the very end of the game. So, conclusion I want to make based on that, there are certain pawn structure positions that you have to know. You have to know. There's some things you can discover yourself once you see an orthodox pawn structure. Wait a minute, I have not seen that before. Let's judge, is it good for me or not? But some positions, they are preset already. They've been thought over for you already, and they're known. They are bad or good or bad, and you have to know them. Once you know them, they're good or bad, you also have to know why are they so good. They are good because your opponent's pieces are totally shut off. You have to know that. Just knowing that they are good is not good enough. If you know they are good because your opponent's pieces are totally immobile and you can develop activity on one side of the board, then once you know that well, that will never cross your mind to open center and let those pieces into the game. So keep this in mind, follow the logic of your pawn structure, and you will be in good shape. Thank you very much.